Hey everyone, JJ Cooper, Mark Chiarelli here. We are doing another of these organization deep dives. Today, it's the Athletics. And I note it is the Athletics. I can't put anything in front of that officially. They're not the Sacramento Athletics. They're not the Oakland Athletics. They're not the Las Vegas Athletics. For now, they're just the Athletics, even if they're going to play in Sacramento. Mark, glad to be. I don't think we've ever done a podcast, you and I together, which is crazy because we talk all the time. Excited. Mark does our A's list. We're excited to dive into this, but I will start by setting the stage by being very cliched and saying last year was the worst of times to be an A's fan. But last year also was a better time for the organization as far as actual on the field product than we've seen in several years. Was that a weird mirage, do you think, because of the odd, 2024 season? Or is that the sign of this is the team that is kind of making a nice step forward that should go forward even further? Is this organization on the way up, Mark?
I think so. I think it's real. I think that a lot of the building blocks who had success in that second half of the year where they were close to a 500 team are blocks that are in place for a long time. I think Lawrence Butler is a huge win for that organization. Mason Miller, back of the bullpen. Brent Rooker has turned into an all-star. These are all building blocks, and I know we talked about this. They've certainly acted since the season 2 like a team that thinks their competitive window is opening, and they made some more aggressive moves this winter that I think make a lot of sense just based off where the rest of the roster is.
The thing that does stand out to me about it is that this is a team that still needs to kind of fill some spots. But the great news for it is if you have a well-rounded team of mediocre starters, it's really hard to get from that to better, right? Like, in my opinion, like if you have a lot of 1.5 WAR players, the Chicago White Sox dream of the day that they have a lot of 1.5 WAR position players, but 1 to 1.5 WAR position players, the Abram Toros, of the world, those kind of guys, if that's what you're relying on, it's like, we got to 68, 70 wins that way. It's really hard to step up from that if you don't have guys who can be more than that. When I look at the A's right now, the A's had Brent Rooker was much better than that. Lawrence Butler for half a season was much better than that. Shea Langoliers is better than that. Now, Zach Geloff wasn't last year, but he was the year before. So there's a reason to hope that these are all like 3, 4, 5 WAR guys. You can then add some guys around that. Well, then you really got something, because successful teams have guys who are not just slightly above average, but you have some real foundational pieces to build around. And when I look at a Butler or a guy like these are guys who showed some signs that maybe they can be that. And then you add in the farm system, looks like it has a couple more who might be able to be like that. I do feel like I'm a little bit more optimistic about this A's team than I've been in years. And I say that, like, I'm old. I've been around for a long time. I was, at Baseball America during the Moneyball era, but I would even go back further, much less far back than that. But you look at those A's teams at the end of last decade, and year after year, they always seem to punch above their weight. And you'd be like, how did they do that? And it'd be like, well, they platooned really well. Well, the other thing they did that is the A's 2012 draft is one of the greatest drafts you will ever see. They produced massive talent. And you kind of look back on it now, and I'm almost embarrassed to say that at the time I was asking the question of how a team that had Matt Chapman, Marcus Semien, and Matt Olson in the middle of their lineup was really productive. And it's like, well, yeah, wouldn't that logically be a really productive team? I mean, those are stars. But I look at this team right now, Mark, and again, like you said, like Lawrence Butler, that wasn't a mirage of something where you say, oh, no one ever saw that could be in Lawrence Butler's future. But I would say at the same time, to his credit and the A's credit, it was always if everything breaks right, that's what he could be kind of type of player, right? And it broke. To his credit, he's just kept getting better to where that became the half season he had last year.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, they're not the Angels just rocketing guys to the majors, but the A's seem pretty comfortable aggressively sending guys to the majors to use it almost as a finishing school, which is what you do when you've been kind of mired in where they've been the last couple of years. I don't think that I expected, if you asked me a year ago, that I'd be saying JJ Bleday was a 2-win player for this team, but it happened last year. And you touched on it too, there's more help coming pretty soon. Jacob Wilson got there by the end of the year and maybe would have even lost prospect eligibility if he hadn't gotten hurt. He's entrenched at shortstop, and they've made some moves. I really like the Jeffrey Springs trade over the winter. Like, those are the kind of trades that you need to make, because I'm sure when we talk about weaknesses, the one thing that jumps out in the system is just kind of high-end pitching. And now they're starting to address that as well. There's a lot of interesting things going on here.
The other question I would ask with that is I do want some post-hype, some post-graduated prospects, I would say. We touched on, you mentioned Bleday, who is the epitome of a former top prospect who's kind of had a nice little resurgence well after the shine was off of his prospect status. But we mentioned Geloff, who, last year struck out a lot, needs to kind of have a bounce back to where he was the year before. But I want to ask, what about with Tyler Soderstrom? Is the shine off there, or is there still the hope that this is a guy who, admittedly, still quite young? Is he still potentially a significant part of the future, or are there more questions now, do you think, than assurances?
Well, I got roughly 1,000 Tyler Soderstrom questions when we do our annual prospect chat. And admittedly, since he wasn't prospect eligible, I didn't talk to as many people about him this winter, but he's the one who jumps out to me, where if he's looking at the depth chart and what's happening around him, there isn't a ton of runway here for him to make a positive impact, because Nick Kurtz is coming in the corner positions, and with the A's, it's starting to fill up. I think that he still makes enough impact to where you need to let him accrue maybe 2-3 months of at-bats here to see what it is. The knock over the last 12 to 18 months is that he just doesn't make great swing decisions. And I think that it started to get a little bit better at the end of last season. I think he was roughly a league average performer in terms of WRC plus by the end of the season. There's a ton of thump there. The approach needs to get better, but he's the one. It's certainly, and I think when we talk about Nick Kurtz, I don't think Kurtz is going to allow him to, take half the year to get going. I think that there's some competition coming very quickly.
Especially when you think about the fact sometimes you would be like, if you end up with 2 productive first basemen, no big deal. But Brent Rooker's a DH. Brent Rooker's really not an outfielder.
Well, and I was mildly surprised they brought back Seth Brown as well. So he's someone there too who will need at-bats, at least for the first half of the season.
I would say this: we'll get to Kurtz a lot more in the near future here on this pod, but I would say that this does work out well here from a standpoint of okay, the clock is clearly ticking, and it's a clock. It's not a calendar. We're not talking about, though, when we get to 2026, we'll figure out what Nick Kurtz is. Probably, it very well could be before then, but they do have this little window, right? They have April, May, June to kind of figure out with these guys. And not that if Tyler Soderstrom's not hitting in June, you're like, okay, well, we're just DFAing him and getting rid of him. But it does feel like, okay, that's your window, that if Tyler Soderstrom's having a very good year, then you figure out, okay, well, he's had some positional versatility. We can figure out when Nick Kurtz gets here where we slide him in. Yeah, I do feel like we're going to just know more. We're going to know a lot more about Soderstrom at that point. But the other thing you just hit on here is Seth Brown kind of coming back is maybe a little bit of surprise. But to the credit of this team, now that Wilson's already there and kind of finished the season there, now that they added Gio Urshela, and I'm not saying that Gio Urshela is okay, well, third base is now handled, 2035 is the next time we'll need to worry about anything like that. But he's a credible placeholder type guy. As opposed to a couple of years ago, this is the lineup that doesn't have a lot of that's a gaping wound that has to be addressed. It's much more of these guys are really good. These guys are adequate, and there are more guys on the way. I feel like, is that kind of where the lineup is right now?
Yeah, I think you hit on it. It's third base. It's what happens there in the long run. I think we are Gio Urshela respecters, but I think that they certainly would love to see one of Max Muncy or maybe Darrell Hernandez, although I think he might be more of a utility type when it's all said and done, win this in the long run. I don't think Muncy's quite ready yet. But third base is still a question mark. And I don't know that even the A's are quite sure at this point what exactly Zach Geloff is. Probably some combination of what we saw in his debut in last season. But the outfield's pretty good with more help on the way. And then you turn your attention to the rotation as well.
And you hit on it. The other I think the bigger question now, they have done work here again. Luis Severino is a credible, longtime veteran major league starter. They traded Joe Boyle away, basically in a deal with the Rays to bring in Jeffrey Springs, who's coming off of, he was coming off of injury, but at the same time has been a very good big league starter for the Rays when healthy. And I think actually they kind of took advantage of kind of a roster jam, I think, that the Rays were facing, which with a whole lot of starting pitchers who don't have options. And so like, okay, how are we going to work this out? A's raise their hand and say, hey, we'll take a starter who's, on a reasonable contract. And then JP Sears and Mitch Spence, who were very credible. Great Rule 5 pick in Mitch Spence's case last year. I'm always going to note that. To their credit, you still want a little more depth there, but that's also a credible rotation at this point. This is what we're kind of saying with this is I feel like if we were talking at this time last year, this time 2 years ago, we'd be like, this is pretty bleak. There's a guy here, to focus on. This is a team that, if everyone stays healthy, has a chance to be okay.
Has a chance to be okay in a division where a lot of teams are either treading water or going backwards. I think it's interesting. I'm not ready to put playoff stamp on it for this year, but it's an optimistic outlook. And I know that we're going to spend time talking about the system too. I went through this process for our handbook, more optimistic about the depth of the system than I have been in the last couple of years as well. Like there are more guys in that, say, 5 to 17, 18, 19 range where you're like, this could be an interesting, useful big leaguer to kind of layer into this outlook.
The other thing that stands out to me that's happened now is a couple of years ago, I don't know if it was player development, I don't know if it was poor trades or whatever, but like when the A's did their selling off, and they did a lot of selling off because, we had the Sean Murphys and the Matt Olsons and all, the everyone must go almost fire sale. They didn't get a lot back. And not only did they not get a lot back, but you could kind of say, even almost from that moment, a lot of it was like, what else, right? Like they acquired Ryan Cusick, they acquired Joey Estes, Shea Langolier's okay, but that was also a deal where Brewers, to their utter credit, are like, we've got a Story Ruiz, hey, we'll take Contreras off your hands. Like they didn't really. You're in an ideal world, that's kind of where you really do a job. Like you look at the Nationals, who I think are kind of the gold standard of doing this right now, which admittedly Juan Soto is a different level of player that you're trading. But like when you trade Juan Soto and you get back Mackenzie Gore and James Wood and Harlan Susanna and CJ Abrams, well, hello, that's a rebuild start. That's a rebuild starter kit right there. The A's didn't do that, which I do think kind of led to a little bit further of this kind of wandering in the wilderness time. However, you look at it now, I guess my question is there something clearly that has changed? Because you do look at it right now, I would say they're getting better outcomes from their players as they come up through the minor leagues as well. Admittedly, Jacob Wilson flew through the minors in about a minute and a half, but Lawrence Butler, you mentioned some of these guys that Zach Geloff the year before, they're getting better outcomes now, I feel like, than they were a few years ago.
Yeah, I don't think there's a magic bullet or a special elixir. A lot of the player development pieces that were in place then are still in place. There's always been a decent appetite for risk, and sometimes that can burn you when risk is Gunnar Hoglund or JT Ginn, and those guys get banked up. Risk is willing to take Kyler Murray in the draft in the first round, and that backfires. When those things stack up together, those are really tough to come back from. And I think that even still applies in terms of the risk appetite to the guys that have worked out. Lawrence Butler was a 6th round pick who needed a lot of work. Mason Miller had a very non-traditional background, was not a first-round pick. I think it's those guys in the second, third, fourth round. They've hit on him in the last couple of years, and they've also picked some guys who could move pretty quickly. Like you mentioned, Wilson. Miller did not spend much time in the majors. Geloff was a pretty polished product even when he got to professional ball. So they've been more eager, more willing, I guess, to run them up pretty quick as well.
That leads into another guy who we think is going to move pretty quick. Number one prospect in the A's system is Nick Kurtz. We're going to dive into him right after this quick break. And we're back. So, Mark, Jacob Wilson may end up being, I don't know if there's anyone else out there who can say this. If Jacob Wilson is done with the minors, which I would hope that he is for his sake. Jacob Wilson, I'm checking this to make sure as we do this, but I believe he would be like pretty much the only career minor league 400 hitter that I can remember. And when I say remember, 401. He is a career minor league 401 hitter who's in the majors now. I hope for his sake he doesn't have any rehab assignments or whatever. I just want him to sit on a 401 career average for the rest of his pro career. That would be truly remarkable. No one has hit 400. Now, admittedly, he was hurt for a while, and that is 307 at-bats over his minor league career. But no one has hit 400 in the minor leagues in a full season since Arubio Durazo, which was back in the 20th century. So, this is incredibly rare. He did that. He's not their number one prospect, even though he's eligible. That tells you how impressive and how much you're impressed, how much we're impressed with Nick Kurtz, doesn't it? What is it about Nick Kurtz that stands out?
That was very professional tease right there, JJ. I like that one. Yes. And so, admittedly, I recognize that it's very convenient to say this after you draft a player. But in the reporting process, I heard over and over and over again that Kurtz was their number one guy on the board the entire spring. And I think that he's huge. There's so much physicality there. There's a ton of performance and pedigree throughout his time at Wake Forest. And he got to pro ball and he got hurt. But in the very small sample during the season and then in the Arizona Fall League, he did nothing but rake and hit for a ton of impact. I think there's a lot of conviction in the overall offensive package, not just the advanced power, but also his pitch selection, his approach, his ability to go other way. I think it's a very polished bat. He's above average to maybe plus when it's all said and done defender at first base. So I think that those are really interesting building blocks. I don't think he's going to spend a lot of time in the minors either. He's going to go to big league camp. He might not break camp, but I think that, there's not too much minor league seasoning left for Kurtz before we start to see what it looks like in the majors.
So what is a hopeful but not unrealistic? Like, again, this guy's going to move fast. The thing that stands out with him is that it does seem like that the reports are what is an optimistic but semi-realistic hope is that this is the guy who really could be kind of like the full package, and admittedly at a less defensive, it's not gonna be as much defensive value. He's a good defender, but like it's first base. But this is average on base and slugging, right? If it all comes to what the scouting reports, what the expectations are.
100%. I think the best case scenario is an all-star first baseman. And I'm not going to, it's a high bar to clear for sure at that position, but I think it's an all-star.
Right.
Go ahead.
It's not as high a bar as it used to be because we are now in a world where the number of truly top tier first basemen, like we're working on a piece on this for down the road, but like used to be first base here, shortstop production offensively here. And over the years, it just keeps getting closer and closer. And if you said, who are the great first basemen right now? You're going to run out of names pretty quickly. I mean, there still are some, but you're going to run out of names pretty quickly. And Nick Kurtz, again, like, especially if you look in the AL, like, okay, I'm not saying he's going to be Vlad Jr. anytime soon, but there's a lot of first basemen playing in the AL who aren't anywhere in that realm. Now, the other thing that you said, the A's are a team that has a tendency to move players quickly. You spelled this out when you talk about that Tyler Soderstrom's window is shrinking here. I guess the key thing we should focus on here first is health, because I mean, Kurtz came back remarkably quickly last year in his draft year from a reasonably significant injury. But it does seem like we're talking about, like, it seems like you'd almost be shocked if Nick Kurtz is healthy and not playing for the A's by August. That almost seems like a surprise at this point. Which is that because of their aggression, or is that just because there might not be that much left? Having played as he did at top level, college competition, how we're seeing some of these guys move. Is that more about Kurtz, or is that more about the A's approach?
I think the answer is probably yes. I would lean Kurtz more than anything. There are some minor swing and miss concerns. I think it'll probably come with anyone who has 6'5". He's got long levers. Like, there will be a little bit of whiff, but it was never overwhelming in college. You mentioned the durability piece. He hurt his shoulder at Wake Forest. I think that's probably a little bit more of a concern than the hamstring injury that happened once he came to pro ball. So yeah, you love to see him demonstrate that he can post every day. Once that happens, I think it's a very mature approach. And to kind of double back to your question before, when you were asking about other first basemen, I was trying to do this exercise prior to the podcast, and I'm looking at some of the younger first basemen who ranked pretty highly last year. And it's like, well, I think he can be a better overall hitter and probably play better defense than Tristan Casas. He's a better athlete than Josh Naylor. You start moving up the list pretty quickly. And yeah, I think it's a top 5 first baseman at some point. He's in that 5 to 10 range relatively quickly.
That's kind of the point I'm making is okay, we've got Vlad Jr., Bryce Harper's now a first baseman. We got Freddie Freeman. And I mean, we've got basically Pete Alonso, who, I mean, as we're recording this, it's like, please, someone sign me.
Someone will get him, right?
But you run out of those names pretty quick. I mean, you run out, Carlos Santana was a first baseman in some demand, and I love Carlos Santana, but he's getting up there in age. Yandy Diaz, Jake Cronenworth, who really, in probably an ideal world, you'd love if he was still playing some second base. Yeah, I just pointed out. Yeah, I'm just going to say, like, the bar that you have to clear to be an all-star first baseman right now is not as high as it would have been, I feel like, a generation ago. Because, and, I think part of that is that as the game's gotten more athletic, as more athleticism is required, it's been harder. That big hulking slugger who can't hit, who's really productive at first base, I think those are kind of getting athleted out of the game. And the guy who used to move, Corey Seager, doesn't play first base. Corey Seager still plays shortstop. The bigger guy who before was like, no, he can't play short. He's a fringe average runner. He's a below average runner. Now that guy plays short, especially if he's got an arm. He gets positioned well and all that. But that kind of ties us into, also, we just mentioned Jacob Wilson made it up to the big leagues last year for the A's. 2 questions I have with him, kind of trying to dive into this a little bit. Defensively, what are the hopes? What are the expectations for him? Because obviously, I do think if he can be that above average, that plus glove at shortstop, that would be huge for them. Is that a realistic hope? And then the second part is, how much is he's great at bat to ball skills. I just mentioned he's a 400 hitter in the minors. Is his lack of impact, his lack of power, is that going to kind of limit what he can do at the major league level? Or are there reasons to think that that's not as much of a concern as maybe I'm making it out to be?
So on the defense piece, I think plus is a little hot. I think you best case with him, you hope it's above average defense. I think the range is really the question mark there, a little limited range wise. I don't think that, and it was not a huge sample size, I don't think his big league defense graded out particularly well. The arm is pretty good, but not spectacular. So he might have limited range, but he can make all the plays. He can stick there in the long run, but I think plus is a little hot. I'm going to plug your story that you wrote midway through the season on just the ridiculousness of the Jacob Wilson bat to ball. And if anyone's listening to this, wants to subscribe, baseballamerica.com, very much worth it. It's such outlier bat to ball. I don't think there's a lot of power coming. So to answer your question, yes, I think the power is limiting to his value. And for me, I think we had him 16th at the end of the season in the top 100. He's going to drop a little bit when we post that list. That would be the reason why for me. It's just there isn't a ton of impact so far that we've seen or that we see coming.
Okay, now I'm going to take it. I'm not trying to be hot takey here. I'm asking a question. I don't mean it this way, but I want to ask it this way just because So if I'm the most pessimistic A's fan out there, and there's a reason for A's fans to have pessimism right now, especially if you're based in Oakland, I get it. So what makes him not Nick Madrigal then? Because Nick Madrigal was a guy who was extremely highly regarded, a top 5 pick, incredible bat to ball skills. Then he hit pro ball, and the lack of the ability, like the bat just basically got blown out of his hands, right? Like he just didn't hit the ball hard enough to make pitchers worry about him, which meant that his walk rate dropped. Instead of being that 70 hitter that we thought he was going to be, it was more like, okay, he's a 50, 55, maybe a 6. And there wasn't enough else there. So he kind of very quickly slid from top prospect to journeyman. Jacob Wilson's already done more than that. I would say that, like, obviously, defensively, the fact that he's a shortstop and not a second baseman helps a lot there. But I do feel like that. I feel like he is in a different group, though, also from Madrigal, as far as this is a guy with bat to ball skills who sprays the ball, but it's not something where, to go the old Little League form, it's not like the pitcher steps off the mound and says, everyone come on in, and stand just beyond the infield.
Yeah. The exit
Fair?
velocities are not appalling. It's, it's not good, but it's not appalling. I think that the optimistic outlook on Wilson's impact is that he's a fairly wiry athlete who has started to put on a little bit more strength and did hit the ball with a little bit more authority this year than he did a year ago. So I think that would be the answer. You also took a big one that I was going to say. He is a shortstop, and I think can stick at shortstop. I think he's best case
That's a big
scenario.
difference.
Yeah, it's a really big difference. I think on a good team, I think he's the type of player that is more valuable to a good team as well. You put him at the bottom of the order, he makes a lot of contact, and you hope for 8 to 10 homers. I think it's probably the best case scenario there with Wilson.
I will say I will give a little credit here to Baseball Savant, which is an outstanding resource. And so if you look at Savant here, you see a lot of dark, deep blue there, like the bat speed, the average exit velo, all that is not exceptional by any stretch for Jacob Wilson, but the squared up rate is really good. And so I do think that is something that is going to, to benefit him kind of in the long term. But it is something where that's why, when to answer I love how we're kind of prefacing this. Like when you see the top 100 A's fans and you look at it and you go, well, why did he drop? That's going to be the reason is we keep reporting this, and that is, and I am going to share this though of, okay, if I did say that I do want to show that I did come to that comp reasonably though. You do see a lot of the same reds and blues for Nick Madrigal that you do for Jacob Wilson. I think that that Jacob Wilson is going to be better, and I think that the key thing is again, playing shortstop is a key part of that. Staying healthy is a key part of that. But that's where there's at least a little bit of caution here. I think we would say is exactly that. But now let's take it to kind of a little bit more big picture, Mark. When you look at this farm system overall, I want to start with what is kind of the strength of this farm system right now?
Hitters in proximity. And we talked about Kurtz. We talked about Wilson. Colby Thomas is coming. They added Denzel Clark to the 40-man roster. Max Muncy is in the upper levels. He was hurt for most of last year, but I think they would love if he ends up emerging as the long-term third base option. So there's a lot of hitters that are pretty close to making an impact. And a couple guys who I'm really interested in too, whether it's Thomas or Clark.
Okay. What are the weaknesses of the farm system right now?
High-end pitching talent. I think there's a lot of, we talked about it at the beginning, there's a lot of number 4s and number 5s. There's a lot of interchangeable guys at the back of the rotation. Luis Morales represents the best case scenario at pairing high octane stuff with a starter's build. He didn't have the 2024 season that I think that we were hoping for in terms of, I identified him as a potential breakout or a potential guy who could run way up the top 100 at this time last year, just based off the stuff. And it didn't quite happen. I think they're very high on Jack Perkins, who's we ranked as their top starting pitching prospects, top pitching prospect going into the season. They need one of Morales, Perkins, Mason Barnett to take that step in the same vein that we talked about with some of those hitters who got to AAA or got to the majors. That needs to happen with a pitcher, because I think when you look at the rotation, whether it's at the big league level or even in the minors, it's the high end starting pitching talent that's a little light right now.
The best high end starting pitching talent they have closes their games.
He does.
And they've said now, it does seem like, they have toyed with that idea, and I get it. This is a challenging conundrum because Mason Miller is exceptional in that role, but also let's just acknowledge that Mason Miller there is some durability risk there. He has been injured. He has missed time. And you're really looking at that, I would say, like you're trying to figure out like that balance of, okay, are we more likely to get the best out of Mason Miller as a closer, or are we more likely to get the best out of Mason Miller if you move to the rotation? I would say if you felt comfortable that you could move him to the rotation and he could stay healthy, he has the stuff to kind of do that, doesn't he, Mark? We saw that in the minors for him. But I also understand where there may be some concern that that's a big if, because, man, if Mason Miller blows out, again, this is your premium talent you have of all these guys. So there's something that you would have a reason to worry about there. Before we wrap this up, also I want to kind of dive. We talk about, if you go to baseballamerica.com, we got the top 10 full reports, everything up there. Check out our top 100 as well. But also, Mark, we dive much deeper than that. We're rolling out top 30s on baseballamerica.com. We have them in the prospect handbook. But who's someone lower down the rankings that kind of excites you, that you're maybe a guy who's a little further away, but someone here like, man, I'm really looking forward to seeing what this prospect could end up developing into?
The guy who came up a lot this winter was Josh Kuroda-Grauer. Drafted him out of Rutgers a year ago. He's a shortstop. When you think about Jacob Wilson's outlier contact ability, Kuroda-Grauer is not quite Wilson. No one was Wilson last year who had more than 100, 150 PAs in the minors.
Chandler Simpson is the only one who was close. Simpson.
Your guy, Chandler Simpson, was
I love
close.
Chandler Simpson, and I think he's a better hitter than he's ever given credit for. So he's the other guy in that group. But continue.
So he's not quite Jacob Wilson, but it's not particularly far off. It's really good bat to ball, really good in-zone contact, and I think a chance for a little bit more power maybe than Wilson as well. He will probably end up being more of a super utility type. I think that there's some question externally about whether he's better fit at shortstop or second base. But Kuroda-Grauer was the one who came up the most this winter in conversations about, already exceeding expectations. And, he get rave reviews for his makeup. I think he touched AAA at the end of the season. He's got those type of bat to ball skills and versatility where he could move, he could spend a lot of time in the upper minors this upcoming season.
And I do think sometimes someone's going to hear that and say, oh, they said utility, so they don't like him. He's not really that much. But like, if you ask me right now, if you look at this A's team, okay, in the infield, what do they need? They need Jacob Wilson to be their everyday shortstop and be a solid player. They don't need him to hit 400. If he did, they would take that, but they don't. They just need him to be a solid shortstop. They need Zach Geloff to kind of solidify his spot, right? Which is be more, again, you're hoping he's what he was in 2023, but anywhere close to like between 2024 and 2023. And you're like, okay, that's good. Third base, they're a little bit, long-term, like what's the long-term answer there? But really the other part I would say they need is that guy who can play all of them and also be productive. That kind of guy has a lot of value. These guys are not all going to stay healthy. And I talked at the start of this about how when you have a lot of 1 and 1.5 WAR guys, it's really hard to get that from that kind of lineup to really success, because every time you're taking a guy out, and putting in a 3 WAR guy, you're only gaining a 1.5 WAR, but at the same time, you're not going to get to that by just these slightly above average or average guys. But the flip side about that is we've seen this with the Angels in the West a lot, which is if you have a 3 or a 3.5 WAR guy, you have that guy who's a regular, who's a really solid regular, and he goes down with an injury. And then you plug in a guy who really could best be described. In some cases, this is the true story of like, yeah, until the Angels called, I was expecting to be a coach because the phone wasn't ringing. And you put that guy in instead. Well, all of a sudden you went from a 3 WAR guy to a -1 WAR guy. That's like you lost 4 WAR at one position. So like having guys who can step in and you don't lose a lot, there's a lot of value to that. And some of those guys then end up having that year where it's like everything broke right and they were an average regular for a year and all. So like, yeah, I love names like that. And I always like to basically stick up for them and say, sometimes I feel I remember when Gavin Lux got traded to the Reds recently, and someone said, it just seems like they added another 2.5 WAR regular. It's not what the Reds need. And it's like, the Reds have only had like 5 of those in the last 3 years, other than Ellie. Like, yes, Ellie's a star, but you know what would make them a lot better if they stopped having half WAR players playing every day and had 2.5 WAR players every day. I feel like sometimes fans can get a little bit rough on like what they expect. I love guys like that.
Yeah,
So
you said earlier,
go ahead.
Let's not get too hot takey, but I'd rather have the 2.5 win guys than not have the 2.5 win guys. So yes. No slight at all to Josh Kroder-Grauer, super utility, who probably ends up getting 500 ABs in a season, playing all around, making a ton of contact. That's a super useful guy for this team. He would be the one. I think too. I know you asked for one. I'm going to give you 2. It's the BA way.
Give me 2.
Steven Echeverria. If you just look at his ERA last year, it's very unsightly. But teenager, low A, Stockton, the stuff is still it remained intact. I think that's a guy who, as Oakland I was trying not to do it and I did it. As the A's retool some of their.
All the time we've done that, I'm proud of us.
they retool some of their pitching dev. He seems like a guy who some of the positive underlying fastballs there, really, really good slider. He just needs the strike percentage on the fastball needs to come up. But all the reasons that we were excited about him a year ago, for me, remain intact. I think that he's someone who, when we talk about they could really use a pitcher to kind of improve his profile, would be my choice there.
That's a lot of good stuff. Hope you enjoyed this. Whether you're an A's fan or just a fan of baseball and fan of prospects, if you enjoyed this, we also feel very comfortable that you would enjoy the Baseball America Prospect Handbook. If you go to baseballamerica.com right now, if you order it from Baseball America, I will be sending you an email, the digital version, really quickly afterwards. Business day, usually. I mean, and I do mean I will send you an email. We're that small that I will send you an email. But we try to act big, but we're a small company that we appreciate you supporting us. If also you enjoy this, definitely check out baseballamerica.com, where you can get all of our rankings, all of our reports. We have top 100. We are deep into college preview. There's so much good stuff. International reviews, scouting reports on every team. You want to know what the A's signed on the international class? Ben Badler has you covered right now at baseballamerica.com. Join the subscribers there. And by doing so, again, you're supporting a small company. You're supporting us being able to produce this kind of great content that we hope you really enjoy. If you are on the podcast, thank you. And please feel free to review us in your favorite podcast provider. If you're getting here from YouTube, we also appreciate you all. And please subscribe. That helps you get more of our videos, helps other people see more of our videos as well. Click on the notifications and you'll know every time we have another one of these. And if you're enjoying these deep dives, we're going to keep them running. We're going to give you deep dives basically from now till hopefully before the first day of opening of spring training games. We will have all these rolled out. So 30 teams, 30 of these deep dives. We hope you're really enjoying it. For Mark, I'm JJ. So long, everybody.